Story 1. The ghosts only appeared when the door was closed. I rented a room recently. It wasn't large. Just a single window, a single door, no mirrors. The landlord called it a quiet space, which I found a little odd, but I needed a place. He left me with only one instruction: keep the door closed at night. He didn't explain why, just said it was an important rule of the house. I figured it was a privacy thing. Maybe he walked around late. I didn't think much of it. The first night, I was exhausted from moving. I completely forgot. Crashed on the bed and fell asleep with the door cracked about halfway open. I woke up the next morning feeling fine. Nothing had happened. The sun was streaming through the window, and the room was just a room. I laughed at myself for even giving the landlord's weird rule a second thought. Second night, I remembered. Just before turning off the light, I walked over and closed the door completely. Heard the soft click of the latch. That's when everything changed. It wasn't a sudden shift, more like a slow thickening of the air. The temperature didn't drop. It just grew, still contained. It felt like the room had sealed itself off from the rest of the world. And then I saw it. Standing near the window, a faint, almost transparent figure was completely motionless, its back to me, facing outward into the night. It looked like it was watching for something, waiting. I didn't scream, couldn't have even if I wanted to. The air in the room felt too thick, too heavy. It was like a physical pressure pressing in on me from all sides, silencing me. Before I could fully process the figure by the window, more appeared. One materialized near the foot of my bed. Another seemed to hover just below the ceiling in the far corner. But they all had one thing in common. They never looked at me. Their attention, their entire being, was focused on the one thing I'd just closed. The door. They stared at it with an unnerving intensity. My heart was pounding, but curiosity and a strange sense of self-preservation took over. I slid out of bed, my feet silent on the floorboards. As I reached for the doorknob, I could almost feel their collective gaze sharpen. The moment my fingers touched the cool brass, they were gone. Just like that, vanished into thin air. The pressure in the room lifted instantly, and the silence was no longer heavy, just empty. The room was mine again. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it was a dream. A very vivid, stress-induced nightmare. And then I noticed things were out of place. It's a single wooden chair, which I always kept against the wall, was now angled toward the door. The bedside lamp was turned away from it. And my shoes, which I'd kicked off by the entrance, were now placed neatly side by side, tucked deep under the bed. I hadn't done that. I lived alone. Something had moved them while I slept. That night I decided to test the rule. I deliberately left the door wide open. I lay in bed, staring into the dark hallway, my senses on high alert. I waited and waited, nothing. No strange pressure, no silent figures, no moving furniture. The room remained perfectly normal. It was clear the phenomenon was directly linked to the door being closed. So, on the third night, I decided to repeat the experiment. I stood at the door for a long moment, then pushed it shut very, very slowly. The change was immediate. The second the latch clicked, the air thickened, that heavy, contained feeling washing over the space. And just as before, the ghosts returned. But this time, there were more of them. The room was crowded with faint, silent figures, all staring at the door. But this time, they weren't just staring. They were moving. Silently, deliberately, they began to shift things in the room. The chair was dragged away from the door. The small nightstand was pushed against the wall. They were moving with a quiet urgency, as if barricading the room, putting as much distance and as many objects as possible between themselves and the entrance. Then came the whispers. At first it was just a faint murmur, but it grew until the room was filled with the sound of overlapping, urgent voices. They were too soft to make out individual words, but the message was clear in their tone. It was a warning, a plea. Don't open it, they seemed to say. Don't open the door. They weren't afraid of me. They were afraid of what was outside, and then I heard it. Sound from the hallway. It wasn't footsteps. It was a dragging absence. A quiet, slithering sound where sound shouldn't exist. Like something impossibly heavy being pulled across the floor, absorbing all noise around it. As the sound grew closer, the door began to bulge inward. Not in a physical sense. It wasn't splintering or cracking. The wood itself seemed to bend, to warp, as if the fabric of reality around it was being stretched and distorted by something on the other side. It was a visual anomaly that made my stomach churn. The ghosts reacted in terror. They pressed closer together, cowering in the corners farthest from the door. Some of them knelt, some covered their spectral faces with their hands. They looked like they were bracing for an impact. But not a single one dared to cross the invisible line of the doorframe. The room was their sanctuary, and they were terrified of what was trying to get in. The entire room began to react. The bed shook violently beneath me. The drawers of the dresser slammed shut on their own with a loud bang. The light bulb flickered and died. It felt like the room itself was alive, panicking, trying to hold itself together against an immense, unseen force. And then a voice came from beyond the door. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening. It was worse. It was patient, calm, a simple, quiet request that echoed in the charged silence. Let me in. In that single, terrifying moment, I understood everything. The ghosts weren't trapped in this room. They were hiding in it. They were spirits, yes, but they were seeking refuge from something far worse. This creature, this entity in the hallway, wasn't a ghost or a demon. It was something else entirely, something that only gained power, that only existed in a defined space when it was acknowledged. That's why the door mattered. Closing the door created a boundary. It defined an inside and an outside. By shutting it, I was creating a pocket of reality for the ghosts to hide in. But I was also creating a barrier that this thing wanted to cross. Opening the door would erase that boundary, collapsing the safe space and leaving everyone inside vulnerable. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, my voice trembling in the vibrating room, I spoke. Not to the thing in the hall, but to the terrified spirits huddled around me. I won't open it. The moment the words left my lips, the shaking lessened. The ghost seemed to relax, just slightly. The immense pressure in the room eased, as if my declaration had reinforced the boundary. There was a long, deep silence from the hallway. And then I felt a wave of disappointment. It wasn't anger or rage. It was the cold, petulant feeling of something ancient and powerful losing interest, turning its attention elsewhere. When I woke up, sunlight was filtering through the blinds. Everything was normal. The furniture was back in its place. The air was light. The room was just a room again, except for the door. When I went to open it, it felt heavier. Not physically, but psychically. As if the memory of the night was embedded in the wood. I finally understood. The ghosts appeared only to protect the space, not to haunt me, but to keep the door shut, to keep their sanctuary safe. I moved out that day. I realized that while I might have the willpower now, one night I might be tired. One night I might be careless. One night I might forget. And that was a risk I couldn't take. Even now, years later, it happens sometimes. When I'm in a new place, a hotel room, or a friend's house. Sometimes, when I close a door, feel it. That same subtle shift in the air. That faint, familiar pressure. I've learned the lesson that room taught me. If a space ever changes the moment the door shuts, you have two choices. You can leave the door open, or you can leave entirely. Because something is always waiting for you to create an inside for it to enter. Thanks for listening. Story 2. The mirror didn't reflect me, it watched me. When I inherited the old house from an aunt I barely knew, I didn't expect much. It was dusty, filled with forgotten things, and smelled of mothballs and time. But among all the antiques, one piece stood out. A tall, imposing mirror with an ornate dark wood frame. It had a small, spiderweb crack in the top corner which only added to its strange charm. I decided to keep it, thinking it would look perfect in my bedroom. The first night, it was just a mirror. I saw my reflection as I got ready for bed. The familiar lines of my face, my own movements. It was an object, nothing more. I went to sleep without a second thought. But then, at 2:17 a.m., I woke up. I don't know why, but my eyes were drawn to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. It's a flicker of movement in the reflection, just over my shoulder. It wasn't my shadow. It was tall, indistinct, and it was standing right behind me. My heart stopped. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. There was nothing there, just the empty, silent room. I told myself it was a dream, a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. The next night I was on edge. I kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting, half dreading to see that figure again. It didn't appear. Instead, something even stranger happened. As I moved, my reflection didn't quite keep up. It lagged behind, just a fraction of a second, but it was noticeable. When I raised my hand, the reflection's hand followed a moment later. It was like watching a video with a bad connection. I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. This wasn't normal. Driven by a morbid curiosity I couldn't explain, I leaned in closer, my face just inches from the glass. I held my breath, then exhaled slowly. I watched my reflection. For a second, it did nothing. Then, after I was finished, its chest rose and fell in a slow, deliberate exhale of its own. A silent breath that wasn't mine. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The mirror was alive, and it wasn't just the reflection. The room itself began to change. Small things at first. The lamp on my bedside table seemed to inch closer to the mirror each day. The chair in the corner, which I always kept facing the window, was now angled toward the glass. One morning, I found a book on my nightstand open to a random page, a book I hadn't touched in weeks. It was as if the room was rearranging itself, drawn to the mirror's silent influence. Then came the whispers. They weren't words, not in any language I could understand. They were soft, sibilant sounds that seemed to emanate directly from the glass. It was more like feeling an intention than hearing a voice, a quiet, persistent demand for attention. I had to get it out. I grabbed the sides of the frame, intending to drag it into the living room, anywhere but my bedroom. But it wouldn't move, felt bolted to the floor, impossibly heavy. It was like trying to push a mountain. The mirror was here to stay. That night, something new happened. I woke up again, that familiar sense of dread washing over me. The surface of the mirror was fogged over as if someone had just breathed on it. And in the condensation, letters were being traced by an unseen finger. Look again. My blood ran cold. My eyes darted to the reflection. It wasn't me anymore. The shape was mine, but the details were gone. It was a tall, shadowed figure, featureless and dark, standing where my own image should have been. It just stood there, watching. The activity in the house escalated dramatically after that. Doors would slam shut on their own. Drawers in my dresser would rattle violently in the middle of the night. Every morning, I'd find objects had moved again, all of them subtly reoriented to face the mirror, like an audience watching a stage. And then I heard the voice. It wasn't a whisper from the glass anymore. It was inside my head, clear as day, cold, flat voice that said, "You see me now." I couldn't escape it. The presence laid out its rules, not in words, but through an overwhelming sense of compulsion. Don't turn away. Don't close your eyes. Don't cover the glass. It was a silent, terrifying contract I hadn't agreed to. One night, I felt an insane urge to test the boundary. I reached out a trembling hand toward the mirror. I expected to feel cold, hard glass, but my hand didn't stop. Passed through the surface, into my reflection. The sensation was horrifying. It was cold, but a wet, sticky cold that clung to my skin. It felt fundamentally wrong, like plunging my hand into something that shouldn't exist. As I pulled my hand back, the whispers in the room grew louder, more urgent. It was a chorus now, dozens of faint, ghostly voices all murmuring the same word. Stop. I started to notice other things. Faint, transparent figures would appear in the corners of my room, especially at night. They were timid, almost scared. They would huddle near the walls, keeping as far away from the mirror as possible. It was clear they weren't with the thing in the glass. They were terrified of it. The entity in the mirror never left its prison. It didn't step out into the room. It just observed, its shadowy form a constant presence in the glass. The pattern was always the same. Every night, at exactly 2:17 a.m., the activity would begin. The lagged reflection, the whispers, the feeling of being watched. Always the same shadow, always the same silent demand. Over time, small, thin scratches began appearing on the mirror's wooden frame. They looked like letters, but in an alphabet I'd never seen. Strange symbols and interlocking patterns that meant nothing to me. The entity was communicating, but I couldn't understand its language. It was also learning my routine. If I tried to move a piece of furniture, I would feel an intense pressure in the room, a palpable disapproval until I moved it back. It was controlling my space, my life, turning my bedroom into its personal domain. I started to realize something unsettling. It didn't seem to want to harm me. All this, the whispers, the moving objects, the rules, it was all for one purpose. It wanted my attention. It wanted to be acknowledged. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what would happen if I broke the rules. I grabbed a thick blanket from my bed, and with my heart hammering against my ribs, I threw it over the mirror. The room went dead silent. The whispers stopped. The pressure vanished. For a moment, there was only a profound, blessed quiet. Then, a new sensation began. A pressure building behind my eyes, growing stronger and stronger until it was a piercing agony. The silence was broken by a high-pitched, shrill scream that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I tore the blanket off. Screaming stopped. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The sun was shining. The room was quiet. I stood in front of the mirror, exhausted. I moved to the left. But my reflection didn't. It stayed perfectly still, its shadowy, featureless face turned toward me. It was no longer mirroring me. It was watching me on its own. That was it. I couldn't stay. I packed a bag, my hands shaking, and left the room without looking back. I left the house, left the key, and never returned. I don't sleep well anymore. Every reflective surface makes my skin crawl. A puddle on the street, a shop window, the screen of my own phone. I always feel like something is looking back. So, if you ever have a mirror and you notice your reflection behaving just a little differently, if it lags or moves when you don't, remember this. It's not broken. It's observing. The other ghosts, the ones you might think could help. They won't. They're as scared as you are. They stay away. Because the real danger is when it waits. It waits for you to get comfortable, to forget that it's there. And even now, I still see it. It's not in a mirror, but in my dreams. Always behind the glass. Always watching. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe for more. Stay safe out there. Story 3. The ghosts only screamed when the elevator stopped. The apartment building I moved into was tall, narrow, and strangely quiet. You'd expect some noise, some sign of life with so many residents packed in, but most of the time, there was just silence. It felt wrong, unnatural. And then there was the elevator. Just one for the whole 32-floor building. It was an old, clunky machine, slow as molasses and prone to stalling between floors. The management company had a cute name for it. They called it temperamental. I had other words for it, especially after the first incident. I was heading up to my apartment on the 21st floor. The elevator creaked its way past the 5th, then the 6th, and then, with a soft sigh, it just stopped. Dead still, somewhere between the 6th and 7th floors. The light stayed on, which was a small mercy. There was no jarring jolt, no emergency alarm blaring, just a profound, unnerving stillness. And that's when I heard it. First it was faint, almost like the sound of wind whistling through a crack. But as I strained to listen, it became clearer. It was screaming. Not a single scream, but many. It wasn't coming from inside the elevator with me. It felt like it was coming from inside the very walls of the building, echoing through the elevator shaft. The sound was a horrifying chorus of multiple voices, all layered on top of each other. They were panicked, desperate, as if each person was trapped mid-breath, their terror frozen in time. It was the sound of pure, undiluted fear. My own breath hitched in my throat, my heart pounding against my ribs like a drum. I stood there, paralyzed, just listening to this symphony of anguish. And then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the elevator jolted back to life. It lurched upwards with a groan, and in that exact same instant, the screaming cut off. It wasn't a fade-out. It was like someone flipped a switch, plunging the world back into absolute silence. The rest of the ride up was the longest of my life. I tried to rationalize it. It's an old building. Old pipes, maybe? Air trapped in the system? I told myself that over and over, but I didn't believe a word of it. It was a flimsy shield against a feeling I couldn't shake, a deep primal dread. That night, the dread followed me home. When I walked into my apartment, things were wrong. My shoes, which I'd kicked off haphazardly by the mat, were now lined up in a neat row, all of them pointing directly at the door. The armchair in my living room had been moved, was no longer facing the television. It was angled sharply toward the wall it shared with the elevator shaft. And my keys, which I always hung on a hook, were placed neatly on the floor right in the center of the room. It wasn't just misplaced. It was arranged, deliberately. 2 days later, it happened again. I was coming home late and the elevator stopped, this time between the 14th and 15th floors. The same chilling silence fell, and then the screams began. But this time they were louder, closer. It felt like they were right on the other side of the metal doors. As the screams filled the small space, I glanced at my own reflection in the polished steel of the elevator doors. But behind my terrified face, I saw something else. Faint, shimmering outlines. Hands, dozens of them, pressed flat against the metal from the other side. Their faces were twisted in silent agony, mouths wide open in screams I could only hear. They were ghosts. Trapped. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the image was seared into my brain. I learned quickly that this was a silent, shared secret among the tenants. No one ever spoke about it. I checked with management. No complaints had ever been filed about strange noises. There were no warning signs posted by the elevator. When the elevator did stall, which was often, and you were riding with someone else, an unspoken rule took effect. Everyone would just stare at the floor. No eye contact. No acknowledging the sudden gut-wrenching screams that filled the silence. We just waited. One afternoon, an elderly woman who had lived in the building for decades got on with me. As the doors closed, she leaned in, her voice a dry, papery whisper. "If it stops," she said, her eyes wide, "don't move." Not a muscle. I asked her why. "What happens if you move?" She just shook her head, a tremor running through her frail body. She wouldn't say another word, just stared at her feet until she got off on her floor, leaving me with a new layer of terror. My third time was the worst. The elevator stopped. The screams started. But this time, something new happened. The air in the car changed. It didn't get hot or cold, it got heavy. The pressure built until it felt like I was at the bottom of the ocean, my eardrums aching. It was a physical presence, a suffocating weight. And I realized, with a cold certainty, that this feeling wasn't coming from the ghosts. The ghosts screamed. This thing listened. The poltergeist activity I'd experienced in my apartment escalated inside the elevator car itself. The whole car began to shake violently. Not the gentle rocking of a machine, but a deliberate, angry rattle. My work bag, sitting on the floor beside me, lifted a few inches into the air and then dropped with a thud. The lights didn't just flicker. They began to pulse in a slow, rhythmic beat, like a monstrous heart. And in that moment of pure terror, I understood. The ghosts weren't haunting the elevator. They weren't trying to scare me. They were trapped inside the walls of the building, pinned, compressed by some unspeakable force. The elevator stopping wasn't the haunting. It was the trigger. It woke something up, something that fed on the silence and the stillness. A shadow passed under the crack beneath the elevator door. It wasn't the shadow of something moving past. It was a shadow that stretched and grew, like a pool of ink spreading out from a single point directly below me. On pure, stupid instinct, I reached out and touched the cold metal wall. The screaming instantly intensified, becoming a deafening roar. Through the doors, I could see the ghostly hands pressing harder, figures recoiling, trying to get away from something behind them. They weren't screaming at me. They were screaming because they were being crushed, and they were trying to escape from whatever was in the shaft with them. Then, a voice filled the car. It wasn't a ghost. It was calm, articulate, and utterly devoid of emotion. "Remain still," it said. The heavy pressure in the car shifted, consolidating into one spot directly beneath my feet. It felt like something was standing up, right below the floor of the elevator, its attention focused entirely on me. Just as I thought my heart would explode, the elevator lurched violently. The lights snapped back to full brightness. Ash! The crushing pressure vanished. Ash! The screaming stopped. The car resumed its slow journey upward, and the silence that returned was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. When I finally got to my apartment, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock, I found the door was already slightly ajar. I pushed it open, my mind racing. Nothing was stolen, but everything had been rearranged again. This time, however, it was different. The ghosts hadn't just moved things. My sofa, my bookshelf, my heavy dining table, everything had been pushed up against the wall that faced the elevator shaft. It wasn't a mess, it was a barricade. They were trying to reinforce it. It's trying to keep something out or in. I started to see the pattern. The elevator only ever stopped when someone was alone. It never stalled when it was crowded with people coming home from work or filled with the noise of conversation. This thing, this entity, it preferred a singular audience, wanted your undivided attention. I don't take the elevator anymore. I take the stairs. It's all 32 flights, up and down, every single time. It's exhausting, but I don't care, because I know what waits in the quiet spaces between the floors. So if you're ever in an elevator and it grinds to a halt, and you hear a faint screaming from the walls, listen to me. That's not what you should be afraid of. Don't listen for the screams. Listen for the silence that comes after, because something else is in there with you. It was listening first. Thanks for listening, and if you like scary stories like this, make sure to subscribe. Story 4. The ghosts only watched from doorways. The real estate agent mentioned it casually, almost as an afterthought. Doors tend to open on their own. She laughed, a light, airy sound that didn't belong in the dusty old house. I didn't laugh. That first night I made sure every single door was shut. The heavy oak of the bedroom door clicked firmly into its frame. The bathroom door, the closet doors, even the little pantry door in the kitchen all closed. But when I woke up, the morning light spilled into the room from the hallway. Every door in the house stood open. Not just a crack, but wide enough to walk through. Every single one. It was the position that got to me. They weren't flung open wide, nor were they just slightly ajar. Each door was open just enough for someone to stand in the frame and see through. It felt intentional. It's like someone was peeking, waiting for me to notice. And then I noticed. It was in the bathroom doorway. I'd just finished brushing my teeth and looked up into the mirror. Reflected behind me, framed perfectly by the door, was a pale, shimmering outline. It was completely still, just watching. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing was there. But when I looked back at the mirror, the shape was still visible in the reflection. I tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light, my mind playing games. But the feeling of being observed was constant. What was stranger was the silence. There were never any footsteps. The presence never entered a room. It just stayed there, perfectly framed by the doorway, a silent sentinel. I started to think of them as the doorway ghosts. Soon other things started happening. Classic Poltergeist signs, but with a twist. I'd come downstairs to find the dining room chairs shifted. Not knocked over, but angled just so, all facing the doorway into the hall. Pictures on the walls would be tilted, their frames turned to face the nearest hallway. One morning, I found all my shoes from the closet lined up neatly, each pair pointing out of the bedroom toward the open door. It felt less like a haunting and more like a rearrangement. Then a second one appeared. This time, it was in my bedroom doorway as I tried to sleep. It was a different height, shorter, but its posture was identical. Utterly still, observing me from the threshold. Two of them now, two silent observers in two different doorways. They never spoke. They never moved closer or showed any sign of aggression, simply wouldn't cross the threshold. Their entire existence seemed bound to the frames of the doors. I noticed a pattern. The presences only appeared when the doors were open. If I got up the nerve to walk over and shut a door, the figure standing within it would vanish the instant the wood met the frame. So, I started testing it. That night, I went through the house again, securing every lock, wedging chairs under the handles. I was determined to keep them shut. At 3:11 a.m., I was jolted awake. Sound echoed through the house, a soft, methodical clicking. One after another, like old locks disengaging on their own. And then, the slow, groaning creak of wood as the doors began to open. Not all at once, but in sequence, starting from the far end of the house and moving closer. The pantry door, the downstairs bathroom, the living room. Then the sound started up the stairs, the guest room, the study. Finally, my bedroom door swung inward, and that's when the air in the house changed. It wasn't the usual drop in temperature you read about. It was a change in pressure, a stillness that felt heavy and measured, and something else was different. The two ghosts, the ones who always watched me, were no longer looking into my room. Their faint outlines returned, their attention fixed on the dark hallway behind them. That's when I saw it. Something was moving in the hall. It wasn't a shape I recognized. It wasn't a person. It was too long, too low to the ground, and it moved with a deliberate sliding motion. It was a shadow that seemed to drink the light around it, a piece of mobile darkness. As this shadow creature slid past the doorways, the ghosts reacted. They didn't flee, they just leaned back. A subtle shift, pressing themselves deeper into the door frames, as if to make more room for whatever was passing by. The house itself seemed to react. The doors didn't just open, they slammed back against the walls with a startling crack. The floorboards groaned, and the walls creaked under some immense, unseen pressure. The whole house was adjusting, contorting itself. And in that moment, I finally understood the rule. Closed doors meant safety. They were barriers. Open doors weren't just an invitation, they were a pathway. Desperate, I tried to block one. I shoved my heavy dresser in front of the bedroom door, hoping to keep it shut. For a few minutes, there was silence. Then, a knock. Slow. Patient. A single, rhythmic tap coming from the other side of the door. The side that was in my room. And then, for the first time, the ghost spoke. It wasn't a voice, but a whisper that seemed to come from all around me. A dry, rustling sound. Let it pass. It became horrifyingly clear. The thing in the hallway, the shadow, it wasn't a ghost. Ghosts linger. They're tied to a place. This thing traveled, and the doorways, they weren't entrances into rooms for it. They were just points along its corridor. Entire house was a hallway for this entity. The shadow slid from one open doorway to the next, a predator moving through its territory, never once entering a room, never stopping. It didn't want me, it just wanted passage. It wanted permission to move. I knew I couldn't stay. In a blind panic, I scrambled out of bed, vaulted over the dresser, and wrenched the door open. The moment I did, every single door in the house flew open at once with a deafening boom. The house was offering itself up, clearing the way. I ran. I didn't look back at the shadow. I didn't look at the silent ghosts. I just ran down the stairs and burst out the front door into the cold night air. Behind me, with a sound like a single, unified thunderclap, every door in the house slammed shut. All at once. The house sits empty now. You can see it from the street, even from a distance. You can tell that every door inside is wide open. I finally understood what the ghosts were doing. They weren't haunting the house. They were markers. We're measuring a safe distance from something far worse. So here's a warning, a rule I learned the hard way. If you're ever in a place where you see ghosts and they only ever watch you from doorways, remember this. They're not watching you. They're tracking something else. Something that moves only when the doors are open. And it always knows when you're home. Because by opening and closing doors, you leave a path for it to follow. Story 5. The house that rearranged the dead. The house was cheap. That should have been the first clue. No one ever stayed longer than 3 months. They all left alive, though. That little detail mattered to me at the time. I wasn't looking for a fight with the supernatural. I just needed a roof over my head that didn't cost a fortune. So, I signed the lease, grabbed my boxers, and moved in. The first night was quiet. Disappointingly quiet. I was braced for all the classic haunted house trope squeaks, groans, cold spots, shadows flitting past the corner of my eye. But there was nothing, just a deep, profound silence. It didn't feel empty, though. It felt arranged. Like every molecule of air had been carefully placed for maximum stillness. I chalked it up to new house nerves and went to sleep. On the second night, the smell arrived. It wasn't rot or decay. It was old dust and flowers. Specifically, the kind of flowers you find at a funeral home. Not fresh, vibrant bouquets, but the ones that had been sitting there for a day or two. Their scent mingling with the sterile quiet of the room. It was the smell of a funeral that had already ended, the memory of grief lingering in the air. The first real sign that something was wrong happened on day 3. I came home from work, tossed my keys on the kitchen counter like I always do, and went to unpack some more boxes. An hour later, I couldn't find them. I searched the counter, my pockets, the floor, nothing. I was about to give up when I saw them. They were sitting on the stairs, not just on the stairs, but perfectly centered on the 3rd step, The metal teeth aligned with the edge of the wood. It wasn't like they'd been dropped or thrown. They were placed deliberately. That's what I call poltergeist logic. It's never about chaos. It's about a strange, unsettling kind of order. It's the difference between a mess and a message. This was a message. Things escalated. A few nights later, I woke up with that feeling of being watched. I opened my eyes, and there was a chair next to my bed that had been there when I went to sleep. It was one of the dining chairs from downstairs. It had been moved up a flight of stairs into my room and positioned to face me directly. I just stared at it, the wood grain clear in the moonlight, waiting for something to happen. But it just sat there, an empty observer. Then, the ghosts arrived. They didn't burst through walls or scream my name. They faded into existence, like reflections slowly settling on the surface of a pond. One evening, I was reading in the living room, and I glanced up to see them. 3 figures. A man in his 50s, a young woman who looked barely 20, and a small boy. They were just standing there across the room watching. Not watching me, but the room itself. What was strangest was how they stood. They were too evenly spaced, too intentional, like museum exhibits arranged for optimal viewing. The man on the left, the woman in the middle, the boy on the right, a perfect, symmetrical tableau of the dead. They didn't do anything you'd expect. No moaning, no drifting through walls, no rattling chains. They didn't even seem to notice I was there. They were just present, part of the decor, and the house began to adjust around them. Every night, furniture would shift, a lamp would move 3 inches to the left. A rug would be squared up with the floorboards. The changes were subtle, but the goal was clear. Rooms were becoming more symmetrical, more balanced. Even the photos I'd hung on the walls would be slightly rotated on their hooks overnight, their frames always aligning perfectly with the center of the room. It was maddening. It took me weeks to realize the ghosts were moving too, only when I slept. I started taking pictures before bed and comparing them in the morning. Each day they were in new positions. They were closer together, grouped in a different part of the room, but always maintaining that unnatural, balanced spacing between them. They were being arranged. The poltergeist activity picked up. Books on my shelves started stacking themselves by height, from tallest to shortest. My shoes, which I usually kick off by the door, would be neatly paired and squared against the wall. Drawers I'd left partially open would be adjusted, all open to the exact same degree. A pattern was emerging. Nothing in this house was ever allowed to be crooked. Nothing was ever out of place. And then I sensed it. A 4th presence. This one was different. It never showed itself, but its influence was everywhere. An empty space would appear in a room, and the furniture would arrange itself around that void, leaving it open. The 3 ghosts I could see seemed to react to it too. They began to lean inward slightly, toward a common center, as if drawn by an invisible gravity. I started hearing a sound at night, faint, smooth, dragging noise. Like someone was moving a heavy oak wardrobe across a polished floor, but without any friction. It was the sound of effortless, powerful reorganization. That's when it finally clicked. This house wasn't haunted in the way you read about in books. The house was curating. The ghosts weren't former residents lingering in torment. They were just more objects to be arranged. The dead were material. They were part of the collection. And then it noticed me. It must have decided I'd been there long enough to be considered part of the inventory. My belongings started shifting in more personal ways. My clothes, which I'd left on a chair, would be folded in a way I've never folded them, with impossibly crisp creases. One morning, I woke up and my entire bed had been repositioned, pushed 3 feet to the left, so it was perfectly centered against the wall. The first message appeared a day later. I walked into the kitchen, and there on the dusty surface of the dining table, a single sentence was written in the grime. 2 words, "Stay still." I didn't listen. My hand was shaking, but I walked over to one of the perfectly aligned dining chairs and I nudged it, moving it a few inches out of place. The response was immediate and violent. The entire house trembled. A deep groan echoed through the walls. The chair I had moved slammed back into its original position with a deafening crack. And for the very first time, the 3 ghosts turned their heads and looked directly at me. Their faces were filled with a stark, primal fear. But it wasn't fear of me, it was fear of correction. Fear of what happened when order was disturbed. The entity finally spoke. It's not with words, but with an overwhelming pressure that filled the room, a suffocating psychic weight. It was the absolute, crushing sensation of being fundamentally misplaced. I was the crooked picture on the wall. I was the book out of order. I was the flaw in its perfect design. It wasn't a spirit or a demon. It was a force, the blind cosmic custodian that required absolute order, and it was using the dead-end now men to maintain it. I ran. I didn't pack. I didn't think. I just scrambled for the front door while the house itself seemed to be rearranging around me, the floor shifting under my feet, the walls closing in. I burst out into the night and the door slammed shut behind me. The sound was clean, final, and perfectly centered in its frame. Now I know why no one ever stays longer than 3 months. The house doesn't want tenants. It wants exhibits. And people, by their very nature, move. They are messy, unpredictable, and refuse to stay still. We are chaos in a place that worships order. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe for more.